welcome to the Career Now podcast. I'm your host, Jed Lea-Henry, and again, that different introductory music and the different thumbnail attached to this podcast is because we're currently in a series of the Career Now podcast focused solely on Korean literature. It's a short series that's going to run throughout the summer and hopefully pull together a large variety of opinions, thoughts, perspectives, and also academic analysis of Korean literature, which is why our guest today is so important. On today's podcast, we're going to have Ross King. Now, Ross is a professor of Korean language and literature at the University of British Columbia in Canada, and he's also the head of the Department of Asian Studies at the same university. But importantly, his work in the field of Korean literature is impossible to miss. His academic publishing record just runs and runs and runs. There is so much content here. This is a lifetime of work dedicated to Korean literature and Korean English translation. From the outset, when I launched this series, I knew it was going to be important to get Ross on the podcast. And that's why I'm so happy today and so happy to speak about the topic, which is what I just touched on there. The challenges, the problems, the limitations, and what the field of Korean to English literary translation currently looks like and has looked like in the past. For many people, it's one of those topics you may not have thought a lot about. And I must admit, it did brush over me when I first heard about it. Many people tend to have this idea that when translating a novel from one language to another, it is almost a mechanized process. You take a word and you change it into the new language, and perhaps once you've got a sentence, you have to move a few words around to ensure that it makes sense, with all the verbs and nouns in the right place, and then you move on to the next sentence and the next word. But of course, it can't possibly happen like this. And when it does, the story you get at the end becomes almost unreadable. Looking into this, Ross will walk us through the underlying assumptions behind those people and those organizations that support Korean literary translation. Questions about how and where people should study Korean culture and Korean language. Important questions about who owns Korean literature, whether it should be outbound or inbound translators doing this work, how the support finds its way to translators, and whether it should be individualized and short-term or long-term and institutionalized. But most importantly here is going to be Ross's personal experiences with the field. He's been teaching this at the University of British Columbia for a number of years, and he's been deep in this world of Korean English literary translation. And as much as anything, this is going to be a critical look at the field, the mistakes that are being made too often, the false assumptions, and the self-imposed barriers that are holding the field back and limiting a broad range of possibilities. Now, below this podcast, I'm going to link the two articles that I used as research, but I'm also going to link Ross's academic profile, which I encourage listeners to go and scroll through for themselves. It is all fascinating reads, all often deep analytical looks into the field, and I guarantee you won't be disappointed. Now, as always, this podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. We made a conscious decision here on the Career Now podcast not to run advertising in any way, which means the podcast relies on you to support it directly, which you can do at the PayPal or Patreon links attached below. Failing that, you can always share, like, or comment on the podcast across social media. And it's this last aspect which is most important. On that, and to walk us through the world of Korean to English literary translation, this is Ross King. Ross King, welcome to the Career Now podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So today we're going to be speaking about the complexities of the Korean language and also, of course, some of the challenges with translation, which you've done an awful lot of interesting research on. And we might start with an introduction you wrote to Ko Jong-suk's book, Infected Language. This was published in 1999. So as a very first term, and how we might get started on this, why was this book so important? And why is the field of Korean English translation and the complexities of Korean language something that people are paying more and more attention to each day?
My interest in the book was he's one of the few sort of critics. Well, he himself he's a creative writer. He's a critic. He actually he started doing a PhD in his youth in Paris at the Sorbonne. So which he had to abandon because of the IMF crisis. But anyway, he's linguistically trained, linguistically sophisticated. He himself is a very accomplished writer of fiction. And he's also a really astute critic of kind of trends in Korean language and literature, contemporary stuff. And so this book struck me as important because he calls out a lot of the really stupid and pig-headed, narrow-minded Korean linguistic nationalism, and sort of, he celebrates things like hybridity and, the fact that, he calls out the Korean sort of conservative linguists and literary scholars who are all concerned about purity, and he's also just politically fairly left of center and is sort of on a constant warpath against the Chosun Ilbo and sort of Korean sort of alt-right types.
So let's step into some of the detail of that book then, because it's really quite interesting. I might get you to begin with a couple of questions here. You write, and you're quoting, I believe it's Pollack here, and you write about the field of vernacularization, and that is the process of people knowingly becoming vernacular. And I start with this question just because it's the kind of thing that someone who is completely untrained in the field like myself, it wouldn't cross my mind at all. So exactly what is this, and why is it such an important thing to think about when it comes to translation and Korean language?
Right. Thank you. That's a good question. So Sheldon Pollack is a professor at Columbia University, and he's a South Asianist. He's a Sanskritist, and so he has kind of pioneered this new field of what is you could call comparative vernacularization. How is it that modern day national sort of standard vernacular languages achieved independence or autonomy from what used to be a very different kind of language ecology, where serious writing before a certain point in time was done in some higher level cosmopolitan or classical language that basically had to be learned, and a dead language. So Sanskrit in India, Latin in medieval Europe, and in East Asia, classical Chinese, or what the Koreans call Hanmun. And so how do languages wean themselves from that situation? And in the case of Korea did not really become fully vernacular until the colonial period. And then that process unfolded fairly quickly, and under really heavy Japanese influence. And so a lot of that history gets swept under the rug because sort of nationalist, modern day patriotic Koreans find it somehow embarrassing, that for 500 years they had this fabulous alphabet, but really never used it to produce much in the way of literature, and everything serious was written in Hanmun, in classical Chinese. So the standard story that gets told is that underdog Hangul and underdog vernacular Korean, emerged triumphant against a very evil and oppressive Hanmun, and Chinese gets ethnicized and kind of othered at the turn of the 20th century, whereas for 1,500 years before that wasn't the case at all. They were very happily participating in this larger, broader cosmopolitan world, and they were doing so through Hanmun. And of course, it was a small elite doing so, but that's a fairly standard story across the globe. And no one has really told that story for Korea, because the Koreans are just so intent on telling the story of Hangul that all that other stuff kind of gets erased.
So let's drill into that point a little bit then, because they have a quite a unique, not unique, I suppose. I'm sure there are other examples of this, but you write here that, of course, there is that Chinese influence and Chinese characters, but this is a country, when you talk about this process of cosmopolitization and re-cosmopolitization, this is a country that finds itself in a very strange position. So it's got the history of the Chinese characters, then it's got the history of Japanese colonization, where Japanese language was pushed to wipe out Korean language in some ways. And now there is this modern push to, of all things, English, and that is a real, straight to the wall kind of thing. Everyone really is into this inside South Korea. So I might get you to open up that space, that delicate space that Koreans and Korean language finds itself pinched between these three foreign languages.
Yeah, over time they've had to react to these three different kind of hegemonic, bigger languages. And after 1945, of course, they do everything they can to distance themselves as much as they can and as quickly as they can from Japanese, even though the influences of Japanese are everywhere. I mean, if you've ever anybody who's ever studied Japanese or learned Japanese, it's striking how much is there, and how, in a space of 50 years between the 1890s and 1945, how incredibly profoundly written Korean was changed in the image of Japanese, and getting rid of Chinese characters just kind of masks it, but you just scratch the surface and it's still there. But then come liberation in 1945, the Americans take over the South, and then it's all about English. And so, Korea is not unique in having to deal with a kind of overwhelming, English language based kind of Disneyfied pop culture, and English. It's not cosmopolitan in the way that Latin was in medieval Europe or Sanskrit was in pre-modern South Asia. It's a much more, in some ways, oppressive kind of presence, just because now it's got all this technology behind it. And the difference is, and I've written about this elsewhere, I don't think you would have seen it, but in a way, Korea kind of has sold its soul. South Korea has sold its soul for English, and the strategy it has adopted is to become a kind of early adopter and just go all in for English. And that's where you see these kind of over-the-top, chogi, yuhak type things, sending your kids abroad, if you can afford it, to the States or to Canada, and if you can't, well, to the Philippines. This kind of thing, the Koreans, many of them have, on the one hand, as they sort of beat their breasts and claim how much they love Hangul and how important their language is and so on, they're the first to send their kids abroad to learn English. So I see a lot of kind of hypocrisy in it all, but it's the reality. So the English thing, I forget what the subtitle of the book is, and you might have it in front of you, but I mean, the original book, the title was just Infected Language in Korean, Kanjin Ono.
Yes.
But then when we did the English, I snuck in this subtitle of, I think, it ends up with English, right? So, from essentially classical Chinese to Japanese to global English or something like that. And so the sort of linguistic regime in Korea, the ecology of language and writing has, in the space of less than 100 years, kind of just been ricocheting or buffeted back and forth between these three very different traditions.
So I've just found that subtitle for people listening. It is Infected Korean Language, Purity versus Hybridity, from Sinographic Cosmopolis to Japanese colonialism to global English. So I'm going to link that below, of course, for people that want to go and read it for themselves. As you were speaking there, I mean, myself, I live in Korea, and one of the things that most people have noticed when they do come to Korea, as you said, is just how prevalent English language is in almost everything, signs, and it really is almost everywhere. And I wonder how prevalent the remnants of Chinese and Japanese characters are, especially Japanese, I suppose, because it seems that there was a real blending of the two back in the day in the colonial period. So I wonder how much of a hangover Japanese is still within the Korean language. Of course, they wouldn't celebrate it and put it as publicly as they might for English.
So what they did was they just got rid of the low-hanging fruit. And so any words that were that sounded Japanese. So like, I don't know, like, the nail clippers, like sumekiri or something, words that, even like my father-in-law, he's 92, and he still uses a lot of these Japanese words. Or a light bulb, is a tama. Yeah, that's a Japanese word. For him, he uses that. All those words were kind of purged, and they're stigmatized now, unless you're of a certain generation. But then there's hundreds upon hundreds of words in the Korean language which came in as graphic loans. So they were essentially, they came in through Japan and through Japanese, written in sinographs, in Chinese characters, but then were pronounced in the Korean pronunciation. So that then once you took away the Chinese characters and wrote it in Hangul, you no longer know that in origin it's Japanese. And so, if you're talking about those kinds of words, basically all of the intellectual vocabulary in Korean is, in some sense, has been rooted through Japanese. And of course, you can't get rid of those. And you can't really see them now because they don't write them with the Chinese characters anymore. So that's the sort of vocabulary side. But what's more, I think, interesting, and which of course Koreans now no longer remember, is that in the 1920s, when modern Korean writers first started writing fiction, there was this big debate about what kind of pronouns you should use. They didn't have a third person pronoun that they had settled on, for he, she, it kind of thing. And then they also weren't really sure which kind of endings to use, which Korean verb endings to use when writing prose. And so the endings they settled on were in a sense actually very heavily Japanese inflected. They didn't use the old endings from pre-modern Korean, and that sort of stands out most clearly if you look at the work of some of the missionaries in the 19 teens and 20s who were busy translating into Korean certain kinds of, sometimes children's stories and also, of course, religious tracts. But they followed the old endings and ended up writing stuff that nowadays comes out looking very archaic or Victorian, while the young Koreans that of course mostly had been educated in Japan, they like Kim Dong-in, famous writers like this, they were experimenting with a different set of endings that was basically influenced the Japanese.
So that made me quite interested as you're speaking there. And there's something else that you mentioned in this article, which again, someone completely untrained with a matter like myself probably hasn't thought about this too much. And that idea of consciously thinking about language and structures, because often I think people just imagine that they come about organically, they just flow. And of course, a lot of changes in language probably do come about as informal changes. But there's a point in the book here in your article that you write, and it's a quote from Susan Gull, and she talks about, of course, Anderson's famous quote about nationhood and nationalism, the idea of an automation community. And she writes, which you put in here, first, it's clear that not only communities, but also languages must be imagined before they can be socially accomplished. So right. What exactly is meant by that? It's an interesting thought.
Well, I think there's this modern, there's a kind of romantic, it goes back to the German romantics, I suppose, this modern romantic fantasy about language and authenticity, which says that to write, especially to write poetry or to write literature in your mother tongue, it's all about the mother tongue, and it's a very German idea, this is the most natural thing in the world, as if, as if it was just perfectly natural and kind of forced, and no education was needed to pick up pen and put pen to paper and write the words as they were coming out of your mouth, just like they sounded, that this is sort of the natural way to be, and that this is the way vernacularization works. And it's just not true. It's sort of a conceit of modern nationalism that is natural. And so I mentioned earlier Kim Dong-in, who sort of basically is credited with single-handedly crafting what is now the sort of modern literary or fiction writing style for Korean that everybody takes for granted. And he, if you read his memoirs, wrote later in his life after the colonial period, he confesses, he says, hey, the stories that I'm known for, that I wrote and that are out there in Korean, I first wrote in Japanese, and I translated them from Japanese into Korean because, you learning how to write, and whether it's your native tongue or somewhat or a different language is something. It's a process. It's an education. It has to be learned. It takes time. It takes discipline. It's a kind of disciplinary process, and it's just not the fact that you just suddenly out of the blue start writing literature in your own language. And that's true even for the 15th century when they invented the Korean alphabet. The very first texts that were produced were not, Korean literature in Korean. It's all translated from Chinese. And a great deal of the, even a lot of works that scholars for the longest time that are written in Korean, in Hangul from, the 16th through the 19th centuries, like fictional works that were assumed to have been written originally in Korean. You can show that they were almost certainly translated from Hanmun. Sometimes you might not have that Hanmun original, but it's pretty clear that whoever wrote it first composed it in their head in Hanmun and then had to convert it into Korean. It takes hundreds of years before, typically before, from the moment an alphabet is invented to the point where literature is being produced in that language using that writing system, there can be a big gap of a couple 300 years. So anyway, this idea that writing in your mother tongue is as natural as like walking is just, it's false. And so, and the colonial period shows that, but Koreans don't really write that into their histories of Korean literature.
So let's dig into some of the questions around English translation and some of the found real challenges here and the places in which modern Korean language often finds itself, and at least modern Korean translation. Now, this is a different article of yours, and of course I'm going to link this again below. But you start with a very interesting thought, which I'm aware of, but I think many listeners may not be, and that is the idea that in recent years there's been, and I quote, a surge in interest and support for the globalization of Korean literature. So what exactly do you mean by that? The idea of not just of interest, but this globalization of Korean literature, and why do you think that is happening?
Well, first of all, I should qualify that. There has been a surge in interest in globalizing Korean literature, but that interest is coming from Koreans, not from outside of Korea. Outside of Korea, basically no one cares about Korean literature. But now that South Korea has money and sort of clout on the international stage, it's sort of desperate to basically looking for validation. And so they set up, various agencies. And now the one agency, at least the government agency that's most invested in this, is the Korean Literature Translation Institute, which, had sort of other predecessors, but, they basically are pumping Korean taxpayer dollars into promoting and, the translation of Korean literature into various languages. And it's really in an attempt to kind of, I guess, create soft power to buy, or not to buy, but to kind of create friends outside of Korea. So that the impetus is really coming from inside Korea with Korean money. It's true that there's a very small group of people outside of Korea that have a kind of curiosity about Korea now that Korea has more of a presence on the world stage, but that pressure or that kind of impetus towards globalization of Korean literature is very much from within Korea.
So another question that flows into this article and flows from that first question there is a challenge here. And a lot of this, I think, is really wonderful criticism, a thought about this idea of translation in the place of modern literature, at least Korean literature. And you write, this is the question you put forward, how and where should non-Koreans study Korean? And it seems to be a preoccupation within these institutes that you mentioned and within Koreans that if you are going to study Korean literature, you should study it in Korea. So why is that, and why is it such a problem?
Well, I mean, the thing is, if you think about it, Korea and Koreans have absolutely no history of anybody outside of Korea ever learning their language until recently. Korean was just not a language. Korean was not a language that non-Koreans ever learned, and there's only ever really been a reason to do so fairly recently. And the other thing about Korea is, I've mentioned the word nationalism many times. Koreans tend to be very nationalist, and you could blame it on the Japanese and their experience with Japanese colonialism, because Japan operates in a very similar sort of way. There's a kind of unspoken assumption, at least with any Koreans under, over the age of 40. I mean, it's starting to change that knowledge of Korean language and culture is somehow genetic, that if you're not ethnically Korean, how could you possibly understand the riches and the depths and the beauties of our language and our literature? If you're not ethnically Korean, there's just no way for you to do it. And furthermore, how could you ever possibly study it or learn it outside of Korea? Because Korea, after all, is where it's from. And so it's really a kind of very parochial and kind of narrow-minded idea about what language and literature is. I mean, that no one would say, oh, you can't study, German literature outside of Germany, or even in the case of Chinese, there's tons of great research and lots of wonderful translations of Chinese literature into, many different languages outside of China. But Korea, for some reason, just hasn't caught up with that idea that there is no gene that essentially determines knowledge of Korean language and culture.
And on that same issue, there seems to be a prejudice from these funding institutes for PhD and master's degrees rather than undergraduate degrees. And you write throughout your work here how this is, it's limiting the field, but it's also a huge risk. You write it risks preaching to the choir, and it misses out the actual possibilities to attract people to the field in the first place.
So that article, I'm really specifically trying to wrestle with the problem of, well, okay, so if Koreans are so really eager for people outside of Korea to appreciate their literature in their, in their language, whether it's whether it's English or French or German or whatever, what's the best way to encourage, incentivize, and train quality translators, essentially inbound translators who are translating into their native tongue. And in that particular case, it is a fact that in Korea, it would never occur to a funding agency that an undergraduate in his or her fourth year might be capable of, with proper mentorship, of creating a publishable translation of a short story, for example. But and that's what we do and have done for over 20 years at UBC. Is we have a fourth year advanced Korean language course where the students read short fiction and then translate, and working very closely with either myself or with my colleague Bruce Fulton. And over the past 20 years or so, our students have published more than 100 short stories and or novellas into English, and basically without a lot of support from the Korean funding institutions, because in the Korean academic world, undergrads just don't count. They're not people. You're not a real student, and a serious student in that system unless you're a graduate student. And even then, it's still it's all about the world of the kyosus and the professors and professors are God kind of thing. But we've shown in our program at UBC that a talented undergrad, especially if they're majoring in creative writing or in English language and literature, if you find the right kind of student, if they're a good writer and you work closely with them and they read, good translations and then work with a good translator, they can produce good stuff. It's just that the Korean funding agencies would never dream of supporting that kind of student. And then the other issue with this, that the problem is that if you commit to a PhD in Korean studies, no one's going to give you a job for being a good translator. No one's going to give you a professorship because you can translate Korean literature, because that's just not the way academic jobs work. And so it's always going to be an avocation. It's always going to be something that people do on the side in addition to whatever their real job is or their daytime job is. So it's the kiss of death to ask a PhD student to spend a lot of time translating literature, because they'll never get a job if they do.
So drilling down deeper into this Korean gatekeeper kind of mentality here that you mentioned, there is something that, again, I'm very new to this kind of research and very amateur on the sides here, but even I've noticed it, this idea that there is not just the idea of recommended Korean works, but also recommended Korean authors. It's almost like a closing of the field of these are what are the important Korean works and the important Korean writers. So you might yet step that idea out and why Koreans do this.
Yeah, it's very frustrating. They even have lists, like lists of recommended works. And so if you want our funding to translate something, thou shalt choose someone or a work from this list that we've already prepared for you, as if, non-Korean readers couldn't have opinions of their own or wouldn't have a better sense of what might appeal more to an audience in North America or in France or whatever. So there's this sense that they know best, that foreigners could not possibly have a clue as to what would translate well and what wouldn't, and what would appeal and what wouldn't, and what's viable in the marketplace and what's not. And so, there's this gatekeeper mentality. I mean, it worse. I mean, for the longest time, I think it's still happening, there was this notion that if you got funding from, say, the Korea Translation Literature Institute or from the Taesan Foundation, which is another very well-funded foundation, it's basically funded by the Kyobo building people, that company, that corporation. If you want their funding to translate well, and if you're not an ethnic Korean, you have to have a Korean co-translator. because otherwise you might make mistakes, and so you need the co-translator who's Korean to keep you honest, kind of thing. And I think that's just ridiculous, because if someone translates from let's say classical Greek into English, you can't require them to have a classical Greek native speaker co-translator, and why should it be any different with Korean? So the word gatekeeper is correct. I don't think it has softened much since I wrote that article, which is 15 years old. I can't remember when I wrote it, and it's buried in a very obscure place. I gave it at a conference that was funded by some of these government and corporate kind of sponsors in Korea. And of course, it didn't go over very well with them. And they basically have not really acted on any of the recommendations, although the Korea Literature Translation Institute has now set up a kind of very small program where they fund a small number of foreign students to come and do intensive work on translation. And that seems to have been a good thing.
So let's pause on that point for a bit there, because you mentioned the idea that for every foreign translator, they want to bring in a Korean translator to check and to work through the details here. And this is one of the things that you, of course, rail against in your article. It's really quite interesting. You write about this preference for teams of translators rather than individuals, in a way that you hope that people expect teams to work better. And you write here that it's as if people imagine that as a foreigner doing the translation, you couldn't possibly comprehend or understand the Korean language. And for people listening, they may think this makes sense, but you write, and this is an interesting one, and of course, as you think it through, it makes perfect sense. You say, in essence, this is racist and occidentalist. And it's ultimately divisive. It really separates the two communities.
I agree. I mean, yeah, because I said that. And I don't think it's gotten any better. But I mean, what's interesting about it is it's really only Korea that does this. Even the Japanese don't do this. And so if you look at all Japanese literature does have a serious presence, in the literary world in translation. And if you look at all the great works and all the famous works that have been translated into English that are taught routinely, around the world in Anglophone, universities that get bought still, they're not team translations. They're just one lone translator who knows what he or she is doing, and the Japanese have come to realize that once it leaves the Japanese language, it's no longer their baby, and it becomes a new, different work in a different language, and the Koreans just kind of can't let go, and so they're also when you oftentimes what you'll see what happens. I've seen this so many times with our students and with my colleagues. Let's say you're trying to apply for a translation grant, so you have to submit like a 30-page sample translation, which then goes out to a committee of 2 or 3 reviewers in Korea, most of them professors of English, ethnic Koreans who are teaching English language and literature in Korea. And then they kind of vet this translation. And what comes back is it's just embarrassing, because there's this really false idea of fidelity. And what they do is they go in and they pick nits. So it's like, oh, but in this sentence, the translator has left out this word. Or if you go to the dictionary and you look up this word, the translation is X, but the translator has given the word Y. And so it becomes this kind of notion that it buys into what's called like the language myth, this idea, one of the language myths, this idea of one-to-one commensurability between languages, that you just language X has its dictionary, language Y has its dictionary, and for every word in language X, there's a corresponding word in language Y, and if you can't make that match, then it's a poor translation. And so it's a very mechanical, unimaginative, kind of dull and deadening way of thinking about translation and of vetting it, because then it just becomes this nitpicking process. And then at the end of the day, you end up with frankly, really crappy translations that are being selected and published. And then what's worse about some of this funding and the funding now that's coming out. When I wrote that article, there was not as much funding in the system as there is now coming out of these Korean sources. Now what they're doing is they're paying very rich, or well, at least certainly handsome and attractive publication subsidies to foreign publishers to publish these shitty translations, oftentimes actually that are translated not by inbound translators, but by outbound translators, because there are so few inbound translators that they end up asking these professors of English literature in Korea or French or German, that are translating out of their native language into a second language. They are the ones who end up doing a lot of the translation. And then because the publishers are basically being subsidized to publish them, they drop their standards in terms of what gets published. And so a lot of the stuff that's out there, a lot has been published in the last 10 years. It's just not that good. And it's just not really gaining traction. It's not actually helping Korea raise its image as a kind of literary nation, which it really is. But it's just not happening.
Let's dig into that point a little bit more then, that idea of inbound and outbound translators, because again, it's something I never thought about, but it seems to make common sense, as you mentioned there. So the inbound translation is someone translating into their mother tongue, and outbound is someone translating away from their mother tongue. And you're right, of course, what is preferable is that you translate into your mother tongue. And yet for many people, it often goes the other way, especially in Korean studies. So why is it preferable to have inbound translation?
Well, the inbound translator, assuming that they're well-educated, well-read, that they're excellent writers in their native tongue, and those are important conditions, will just by definition have a much better feel for the many different registers of the literary language that they're translating into that's their own. They will have read more of it. They will have a better feel and sense for what sounds right for a particular kind of tone, or they just by definition are going to be better placed and better positioned to make better decisions. And every time you translate anything, it's a series of decisions. Am I going to choose this word or that word? Am I going to use this pattern or that pattern? Am I going to leave this untranslated, or am I going to spell this out for the reader, kind of thing? They're just going to be better at it. And the person doing an outbound translation has that much more of an uphill battle to master all of those different parameters. It's just a no-brainer. But that's true for just about any other world literature in translation, that you don't see these team translations, and you don't see this kind of distorted vetting process, this gatekeeping process, this almost paranoia about, we've got to make sure that these foreigners don't mess this up. It's really, so far as I can tell, virtually unique to Korea, and you just don't see these team translations as much in other cultures. The Soviet Union is a whole other story. They used to do a very different kind of process, which was not team, but kind of, someone would go through and kind of gloss out something and then give the glossed out text, so say it's a poem. In the Soviet Union, they were very good at this. They would take let's say it's a poem in Korean. And in fact, Anna Akhmatova, very famous, Russian poetess, is famous for, she did some really amazing translations of pre-modern Korean poetry into Russian. And she didn't know a word of Korean. So what happened? Someone who knew Korean in the Academy of Sciences in the Soviet Union took some of these old Korean poems and then gave kind of dictionary glosses for all of the individual words, and then gave it to Anna Akhmatova, brilliant poet. She looks at that and then she creates a new poem. And, I can guarantee you that if when she had done that, like back in the 60s or whenever it was, and those poems would have probably been shot down in the vetting process that the Koreans use today for that kind of thing. But the Russian reading public loved it.
That's a nice way to think about it, the idea that it's not about pure fidelity to the original text. It's about a new act of creation in itself. You try and stick as close as you can, but create something in its way. And I wonder how, as you mentioned, this article is a little bit old now. Do you see this changing at all, this field here? Because there are some English translators out there, people like Deborah Smith, who translate the work of people like Han Kang and Su Bei and things like this. And she's fantastic. I really enjoy her translations. But and myself have encountered some horrible translations in this modern literature. So do you think this is changing, or is someone like her just an outlier?
Well, she's actually a really, really interesting example because, and I'm really glad you said that you love her and that you think she's a fantastic translator, because she's actually come under all kinds of criticism by these same nitpicking professors of English in Korea who just gleefully go through her stuff and say, oh, look, you missed this. Oh, look, you missed that. This is not it, and pointing out all these inaccuracies. And at the end of the day, those don't matter. What matters is whether the reader who doesn't know a word of Korean can pick it up and read it and think it's a really beautiful, moving piece of literature. And she did that. And what's even better in her case, and this is why I think she's a fantastic example. I've never met her in person, but she studied at SOAS in England, which is where my first teaching position was many, many years ago. But that's besides the point. But everybody I know who knows her is quick to point out, oh, her spoken Korean is not very good, as if your ability to conduct yourself in sort of colloquial, conversational Korean had anything to do with your ability to translate Korean literature. They're completely separate things. And I hear this all the time from Koreans, like, oh, how could that person be a good translator? His Korean sucks. And of course, they're talking about their pronunciation or their ability to sort of hold a conversation in everyday Korean. Well, obviously, it's important to be able to speak good Korean, but that does not in any way predict how good you will be at translating Korean literature. And she proves that point eloquently. And so I'm personally very grateful to her. But she, if you read the reactions to her in Korean by the Korean literary establishment, she's very controversial, and she's drawing, taking all kinds of flack about all the inaccuracies in her translations. But I think it just shows that the approach in Korea is wrong.
That is a real shame, because I often read books in Korean based on her translations, because it's going to be a very interesting book suddenly.
Right.
And you mentioned here, this is another interesting trend. You write that to overcome this problem with inbound translation that's not always that great, strangely, the Korean literary establishment has been focusing on the idea of attracting second or third generation Korean immigrants to do the translation. And you write here that you yourself have taught a lot of these second or third generation Korean immigrants in Canada. You've taught them Korean, and there's no reason to expect that they would be any better than anyone else. But there's a focus. So this is a really fascinating kind of trend here. So why is it happening? And how do you explain this?
The answer to that's easy. It's the same Korean, tired, blood-based nationalism idea. It's this, you have to be, what do you mean joke? You've got to be ethnically Korean. And so if you're a second generation Korean with crappy Korean because you grew up outside of Korea, it doesn't matter. You still got it in your bones or in your blood. That's kind of the thinking behind it. And it's kind of embarrassing, frankly. So my sort of sense of the prognosis going forward for translated, for Korean literature translated into, let's just talk about English, because that's really the field I know best, is that it's a problem. First of all, nobody really teaches Korean literature anymore. No one really hires Korean professors of literature anymore outside of, like in North America, let's say, or in England. And now it's all about film and media and K-pop, and they're not hiring new professors. So that's one problem. But the other problem is that there's really no infrastructure out there to help train non-Koreans up to the high level of Korean that is necessary to be able to read literature comfortably, and then also to translate it. The Koreans love to, especially the Korea Foundation. If you ever go to their office, they literally have this big map up on their wall, map of the world, right? And then it's pins in the map on, look, we have Koreans being taught at this university here, and so it's like this idea of we want more and more pins and more cities on the world map to say, Korean is conquering the world. And look, in North America, 160 universities are now teaching Korean. But you know what? Less than 10 of them teach more than 2 or 3 years of Korean, which is more than 300 hours of instruction. After it takes 2,200 hours of instruction in Korean to get up to a level where the U.S. government will give you a bonus for being able to use Korean for professional purposes. So, there's this mismatch between the kind of aspirations that the Koreans have for foreigners and for translating their literature and the infrastructure that's available to train them. So by default, then they have no choice but to just basically give it to Koreans who've done that training, but on the other side, who are very good in English, but are never going to be as good as a properly trained English native speaker who's learned, Korean the hard way up through the highest levels. And there's just the infrastructure is not there. There are no fellowships. There are no scholarships, very few opportunities. So basically people start learning Korean and then they bag out and then they go to Japanese or Chinese.
So this might lead into the next question, which I have in front of me, and that is the idea of these Korean institutes and this Korean literary establishment tending to focus their funding on short-term projects rather than long-term institutional support. So again, why is this happening, and what is the downside of it?
Well, so the problem is, another way to put it is that these foundations, they focus on product, not people. So it's all about the book. It's all about the translation. And in typical Korean style, it's a pali mentality. So if they give you the money and a year later, it's like, where's the book? And, good translations don't just happen, in less than a year. Even if you're doing it full time, it's, these things take time and they need to go through, certain kinds of rewrites and so on. So by focusing on product instead of on finding a way to train up a small number of individuals that can do this for the rest of their life at a really high level, they're just sacrificing quality for quantity. And the other reason for it is that these are either corporate or government bureaucracies that have to submit annual reports every year. And so they want to tick off the boxes and say, look, we gave person X $15,000 to translate this novel. And, here's the manuscript. And it might be a piece of crap, but they fulfilled their quota.
As you mentioned before, you teach at the University of British Columbia. I've been there briefly. It's a wonderful campus, and there are not many, as you mentioned, large or substantial Korean language institutes around the world anymore. So I might get the next question to speak about the difficulties in not just in translation, but in teaching translation, which is something that you do. For many people, they would simply equate the idea of teaching translation with learning Korean. So I wonder what the differences are and some of the challenges that you have teaching translation to students.
Well, I think the article that you were reading I think the title is "Can Korean to English Translation Be Taught?" And
yes.
That's the question for me. I don't know that it can, but all we can do is help aspiring translators be better at their work. The course that we teach, that's kind of the gateway course, is called Korean 410. It's modern Korean short fiction. So over the course of one semester, and ideally they do this for 2 semesters back to back, every 2 weeks they read one short story in Korean. And these stories are given to them. They're completely glossed out. All the grammar's patterns are there. All the vocab is there. They're also given English translations. And then, you spend some time in class talking about certain passages. Why do you think the translator made this choice in the English translation? Can you think of a better way to do it? And so it's, and then in the meantime, you're also assigning them short little passages each week saying, okay, next week, everybody bring in their version of this particular paragraph in Hwang Sun-won's Sonagi, for example, a famous short story that all Koreans read like in middle school. And then so it's a kind of, you work through this stuff and there's no correct answer. And there some answers are better than others, but there's no one way to translate anything, which is why this idea of, vetting translations and sort of really hitting hard, it's got to be, fidelity. It's kind of it's a red herring. So the difficulty is that it's not the kind of thing that all students want. Where at that level, it's a 400 level advanced course. The students that we get are typically, they're terrified of the notion of reading a short story in Korean. They've never read a short story in Korean before in their life. And the very thought of it is really frightening to them because they've only had textbook Korean through the first 3 years. And so it just sort of confronting a different literary register of Korean and a short story is very daunting. But then with the materials that we give them, they find that they can actually do it. So by the end of the term, and more ideally by the end of 2 terms, they no longer have that fear, and they're happy to pick up, anthology or a short story and read it and do so without constant recourse to a dictionary. And that's a huge step forward. But then because we're also assigning these other, and they have to do a project at the end of the term where they actually translate something of their own, a short story, no more than 15 pages, say, which is a ton of work. But in that process, it gets you down into the weeds, really down into the dirt, at a very intimate level with a story and with a piece of literature. And that process at the end of it really builds confidence. And you learn also all kinds of Korean that you would not otherwise encounter just kind of talking to people on the street. So it kind of helps the students with their Korean on many levels, and it also helps them with their English. You don't just literary translation does not come naturally to anybody. So some of these students also, they end up saying at the end of the course, "Wow, this is really good for my Korean, but it was also really good for my English writing."
What is the popularity of this course over the years? I wonder, because you've been teaching this for a while, and universities are getting crunched from different directions, and especially crunched towards more and more focused on STEM fields and these ideas of practical subjects. I'm doing air quotes here with my fingers. Yeah. So I wonder what the popularity of such courses are.
Well, that's a great question. Korean traditionally has always been a kind of subaltern and under-enrolled field until very recently. Thanks to K-pop, there's been much more interest at the introductory levels. But even with the sort of popularity of K-pop over the last, let's call it 15 years, driving more and more students into first-year Korean, it has not translated into any noticeable uptick in the number of students majoring in it or in those going on to the higher levels. And that's kind of another discussion. So I always caution the Koreans, to not put all their eggs in the K-pop basket. But the numbers specifically for the Korean 410 class, this translation class, are definitely small. Now most of our Korean language courses up through the 300 level, up through the third year, are well enrolled. There's no problem budgetarily. But the fourth year translation class has always been small, has always been under-enrolled, in the sense that it doesn't meet the enrollment targets set by the university. So these courses lose money for the department. And this is another problem that kind of needs to be addressed ultimately by funding agencies, but which they never think of, is that, it needs to be protected. It needs kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Some sort of sheltering. It needs protection, because otherwise, if it was just left to the sort of invisible hand of the market, it would get chopped. And this is the brutal reality of a lot of stuff in Korean studies and in Korean language. Once you get up to the higher levels, you're down to a handful of students. So 12 students is a really good enrollment for that Korean 410 class. I once taught it with 22, which was actually sort of unwieldy. Sometimes it gets no more than 6 or 7, and that's every university is different, but in our department, if you're teaching a language class and you have less than 21 students in the class, it's losing money.
So I might broaden it out a little bit now with something that you mentioned in the first article that we touched on, and this is a Korean fascination with the idea of pure Korean language and pure Koreanness. And it is something that seems to run through a lot of the themes that we've mentioned so far. And it's an interesting question that you bring up, and an interesting question that runs through a lot of the research here, and that is the idea of if you look at the differences between, say, as you mentioned here, Shilla Korean or modern day Korean, there's a question of, when you look at the both languages, I have no real understanding of this, but is there any idea that they can be both considered Korean, and what this idea of pure Koreanness means? So that's quite a complicated little topic there, but I might get you to open it up and explain this change in Korean language across the years, and this strained idea within Korea that you're searching for this idea of not just pure Koreanness, but also pure Korean language.
Well, I mean, the idea of pure language and a pure national language, I think, is a fantasy for all nationalists and for all sort of 19th and 20th century standard languages. There's this, again, you can blame it on the Germans and on the German romantics. It's Herder and Humboldt and this kind of German thinking that everybody ended up inheriting around the world when they created these modern day standard languages. So I don't think it's uniquely Korean in that sense. It just needs to be called out as a fantasy. And instead, I think you need to direct your kind of energies elsewhere and into maybe celebrating hybridity and celebrating what happens when cultures and languages collide and meet and mix and learn from each other. I mean, there's just a different sort of take on language contact and culture contact. The thing about what is Korean is interesting for any language. So if you imagine you have a time machine and go back in time to the 15th century in Korea, would a modern day Seoulite be able to understand King Sejong's Korean? And chances are that a lot of that verbal communication would be strained. Because the 15th century Korean was all, it's a different stage of the language. It had a lot of different stuff going on, a lot of different words, phonology is different. A lot of stuff would be hard to figure out. But if you go back to Shilla, like you mentioned, it's almost certain that it would be like learning a foreign language. It's a different language. It's over 1,000 years ago. Any more than if we went back to King Alfred's court in, Anglo-Saxon England, we wouldn't understand Old English. So that's just a fact of language change. I think sometimes Koreans just overlook that point when they take in middle school, they go to their, 국어 시간, their national language lesson, and they learn that this poem, this Hyanga poem from Shilla is in 우리말, it's in Korean. Well, okay, yeah, sort of, but chances are that if you were back there in the 8th century and talking to someone from Shilla, you wouldn't understand them.
So as a final question here, I might give a look at the current field of Korean literature. I imagine you must read a lot of modern Korean literature and all the translations. So I wonder what you make of it, because for people from the outside, it seems like there is this flourishing at the moment. And as you mentioned, yes, it is, and yes, it's not. But I wonder how you view the modern Korean landscape in terms of literature, people like Han Kang and Kim Young-ha and these kinds of translations. Do you see this as this flourishing, growing field of not just Korean literature, but literature in itself? Or does it need some sort of prod and some sort of growth? So that's a broad final question, but how do you see this landscape of Korean literature today?
I mean, first of all, I'll be very honest. I'm actually not up to speed on Korean literature in the last 20 years. I have not been following it. My research is now almost exclusively on pre-20th century stuff. I prefer studying dead Koreans and what they write. But impressionistically, I think it's a fact that fewer and fewer people, even in Korea, are reading fiction. For example, if we're talking about fiction, Koreans do write. They read and they write a lot of poetry, and Korea is in some ways a unique place in terms of its consumption of poetry. But if we're talking about, like you mentioned, Kim Young-ha and Han Kang, there is this stuff coming out, but putting aside its reception outside of Korea, I'm not convinced that many people are reading it in Korea. It's a niche thing. And like I said, outside of Korea, nobody's hiring professors of Korean literature anymore. The field has moved in a different direction. Now they're hiring professors of Korean popular culture, and they're studying K-pop and they're studying webtoons, and that's where the kind of exciting activity is happening, is in different and new media. So I think the traditional, kind of approach to, doing fiction and poetry is basically withering away.
Before I let you go, though, I must ask you about that last point you just made. Your academic and interest in dead Koreans. So why the interest? Why do you find that period so interesting and so fascinating?
Well, first of all, because very few people study it, because you need to know, it's really hard to study classical Chinese and modern Korean to read the modern Korean scholarship about it, which is excellent. So it's just a challenge in its own right. But even just Chosun, that's 500 years of a lot of activity, and they wrote a ton of stuff. It's just they didn't write it in Korean. Or if they did, sometimes there are these really interesting interactions between vernacular Korean and between cosmopolitan classical Chinese, and that really hasn't been studied to the extent it should be. Since you do read stuff in translation, I challenge you to go to any bookstore in Seoul and find anything good about pre-20th century Korean literature in English. There's very little compared to what we have for, pre-20th century Japan and China. It's just, it's embarrassing how little we have, even though there's so much, interesting stuff that was written. So the rest of my sort of working days, I'm more focused on that, just because I'm not interested in the recent stuff.
Well, that's a good note to leave it on, and a hopeful note of getting some more translation and some more detail in that period. The two articles that I've been speaking about today that I used as research for this podcast are Infected Korean Language, Purity versus Hybridity, and Can Korean English literary translation be taught? Now, these are just two articles of a long list of Ross's articles, which I'm going to link his academic profile below as well. It was very hard to choose what I was going to use as the research here. There's just so much on there, so much academic profile and so much research to look through. So I do encourage listeners to go and read it for themselves. And on that, Ross King, it's been absolutely fascinating. Thanks for coming on the Korean Now podcast. Thank you very much for your questions. It was nice chatting with you. Thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. I really hope you enjoyed it. This is just a final reminder that we've made a conscious decision here on the Korean Now podcast not to run advertising. And so the podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. So if you do want it to continue, please consider supporting the podcast at the PayPal or Patreon links attached below. Or importantly, you can share, like, or comment on the podcast across social media. And on that, I hope to see you again for the next episode. Thanks again for listening.